Watchers, in almost 1 week, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier will be released on Disney+. And that means it's almost time to announce the winner of the Shield. There's still time to enter though, so don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Marvelous Wave, and leave a comment below telling us who your favorite Marvel villain is. Then head over to Twitter, then tweet us at @StupendousWave with hashtag the Marvelous Wave. Many fans were disappointed when they found that Evan Peters' Quicksilver was just Ralph Bohner in disguise. But this wasn't their first option when they thought about bringing Quicksilver back into the MCU. As it turns out, one of their earliest thoughts was to actually bring Aaron Tyler Johnson back into the MCU. Matt Shakman said in an interview, there definitely were conversations about bringing Aaron Tyler Johnson back early on, but it was ruled out fairly early on. Because this didn't happen, what were the reasons it didn't come to fruition? Also, how would the story have changed if it was Aaron Tyler Johnson? We recently talked about the recasting of Pietro in a recent video and how a lot of it tied into how stories are told in the MCU. To touch on that a little bit, we want to talk about how grief was the main enemy in Wandavision. Again, Shakman also said, having that be a recast Pietro worked on our meta level, but it also made sense thematically when we were talking about grief, which is that grief clouds your judgment. You're willing to believe things you wouldn't. This makes sense from a thematic and storytelling standpoint in the case of Wanda's story. A lot of Wanda's story, abilities, and grief all revolves around the losses she's faced throughout her life. And it happens to be the same way in the comics, constantly leading enemies to use her emotions and her losses to manipulate her into unknowingly doing their bidding. But then there is still the question, what would have happened if Aaron Tyler Johnson did show up as Quicksilver once again? And how would have Agatha brought him back to do her bidding? One of the biggest things I think that would have been missed out if they brought Aaron Tyler Johnson back is that the topic of grief would not have been used so effectively in WandaVision. It is interesting to see Wanda readily accept this new Quicksilver, although he looks completely different. And she does have some trouble admitting that it is Quicksilver, but at the same time, she never outright says it's not him. If it was Aaron Tyler Johnson, the original Pietro, it would have been a lot easier to accept. And perhaps it may have led to her opening up about what happened in Westview a little bit sooner. But then again, it could also have been used as a scare tactic far easier, especially if he was brought back using necromancy. If Wanda resisted his questions and didn't answer them the way Agatha wanted, it could have easily turned into a horror movie with a zombified Pietro chasing after Wanda. That probably would have been a little out of place in WandaVision though, so I can see why they wouldn't have used it. But if it was Aaron Tyler Johnson, there's also the possibility that even if he was being controlled by Agatha, to some extent he'd still have somewhat of his old personality. And this could have meant that they finally get to say goodbye to one another, as Wanda was nowhere near when her brother died. It would have been a sweet conclusion to their story. And something like that might also have calmed Wanda down a bit, helping her release her grasp on Westview. But with all of that being said, how would he have come back in the first place? The first option here is clearly necromancy, mainly because Agatha mentions it. This would have been fairly difficult though, as Agatha mentions his body was filled with bullet holes and on another continent. But seeing as the magic that's used can be used to alter shapes and the appearance of items, that might not have been a huge problem in the end. As for his body being on another continent, it just means that Agatha may have had to show up a little bit later in the show with Quicksilver. But since most of Agatha's story seems to be reactionary to Wanda's use of powers in Westview, it's more likely that she thought of the plan to use Quicksilver a little bit later into the story. But then she could have also just turned another citizen into the Aaron Tyler Johnson Quicksilver. She fairly easily turned a cicada into a bird after all. These are a couple of the more likely ways Aaron Tyler Johnson's Quicksilver could have re-entered the MCU, instead of using Evan Peters' false Pietro. Although it's a little too late now, that doesn't mean we can't see either of these characters again in the MCU. Again, the MCU has stated in the past that they like to bring back characters that we otherwise thought had disappeared forever. After all, it is an old comic book trope, and these are comic book movies, so anything could happen. Do you think Aaron Tyler Johnson should have taken up the role of Quicksilver again? Would you like him and Evan Peters to show up again as alternate Quicksilvers that meet? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and then like this video and subscribe to assemble and join our team, and have a great day.